If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment for more videos like this. What is the most haunted, creepy, and unexplored place in your town that locals fear? If you have explored it, what did you see there? Myrtles Plantation. Definitely. I visited twice and had experiences both times. The first visit was a tour, and I felt a noticeable cold spot in the dining room. Another couple was on the tour, and I noted that it was significantly colder in that room before the guide said that sometimes people feel cold spots. We simultaneously said, "But it is?" I also took a picture of the spotted mirror and captured the shape of a woman in it. My back was against a wall, and it's not me in the reflection. My second visit was with a coworker who was poo-pooing the idea of ghosts. We were standing outside on the drive on a muggy, windless day when we all of a sudden smelled flowers, perfume, and gardenias. Where we were, there were no flowers or plants, and there was no breeze. Later, talking to staff, we were told that they used to have gardenias, but not for a long time. My coworker said after that she still didn't believe in ghosts, but then paused and said, "But I did smell that perfume." Oregon. The Bohemia mining district outside of Cottage Grove can be very creepy. It's kind of a place that time forgot and is still known for unsettling behavior from hobby miners who are still active in the area and other individuals who take advantage of the remote setting to lay low from the law. If you do go there, just be mindful of private property lines as individual mining claims are scattered in what is otherwise public national forest land. French Peat Creek/Olally Mountain in the Willamette NF is another area that makes the hairs stand up on the back of my neck. I was a SAR volunteer years ago, and in one 5 to 10 year period, there were at least 4 cases of men going missing in the area without a trace. It was also a hotspot for Bigfoot activity, and a place that had a history of causing grown men in law enforcement uniforms to get enough of a sinking feeling in their stomachs to hightail it back to their rigs and refuse to go back alone. I lived in the northern part of the Republic of Congo in a town called Mfondo. It was extremely remote. Only accessible by boat or plane. There were many villages surrounding our city that were even more remote and only accessible by a dugout canoe. One of these places was Lake Telly. The locals would talk about an animal or monster called Moklambembe. In Lingala, the tribal language, it meant one who stops the flow of water. They basically thought it was a huge dinosaur that lived in the water there. They would describe it like we would a brontosaurus. They were terrified of where it lived because there were old legends that it would kill people with its eyes, and if anyone ate its meat, it would kill the whole village. It was hard to explore that part of the country because people tend to avoid it. The Nahani National Park in northwest Canada, also known as the Valley of Headless Men, there are no roads leading in, and it is only accessible by boat or plane. The ancient tribes of the Nahani Valley were afraid to settle within the region as they believed it to be an evil, haunted place inhabited by various spirits, specters, and devils. In the 18th century, Europeans began arriving in the area looking for gold. In 1908, 2 brothers, Willie and Frank McLeod, pushed farther into the valley looking for gold and disappeared, only to turn up beheaded. More beheadings and mysterious deaths began occurring over the years. In 1945, a trapper appeared to have been flash frozen despite evidence of having a fire going and clutching a pack of matches. Many others just simply vanished, never to be found. Around 44 people had vanished under unknown and mysterious circumstances by 1969. To this day, there's no answer to what was responsible for the beheadings or the disappearances. The area is so forbidding and remote that very few people other than adventurous rafters ever attempt to explore it. Despite being a national park, Nahani Valley is almost completely unexplored. Duck Lake in the Wallowas, kinda between Halfway and Joseph. First, I'm an old man with decades of experience in the PNW woods and with the animals. What I'm saying is that I know what animals exist and what they sound like. Secondly, nothing actually happened, but there is something around Duck Lake. I've never seen it, but every time I've been there to fish, I and others with me hear something that sounds awful, and we have no idea what it is. And there's more than one. It almost sounds like something that's almost, but not quite, talking and jabbering. Or, rather, shouting. It's loud. And when there's more than one, it sounds almost like they are arguing or fighting. A type of jabbering. The first time I heard it, me and a buddy were there to fish, and the first night there were several of them that went off for 30 to 45 seconds. Loud and close. My friend and I just laid there, until my friend said, "What was that?" No idea. Neither of us wanted to get out in the dark to see, either. It happened 2 more times that night. It creeped me out. Not enough to leave, but enough. I started carrying my .357 when we went fishing the next 2 days. Each day, I would hear what sounded like one making the same noise behind me in the woods for a time or two while I worked along the lakeshore. It felt like whatever it was keeping tabs on my location. Every time I've visited, I've heard the noise. Sometimes it's been frequent and close enough that it's freaked out who I was with enough that we left early. It creeped me out enough, I never took my kids there. I kept going back over a span of 10 years out of stubbornness, hoping I'd see whatever it was, and the fact that it's pretty and the fishing is great. Now y'all can make fun of me if you want, but the closest thing I've found to what we've heard was a recording of what someone claimed was a Bigfoot. The recording makes the hair stand up on my neck and arms because it is the same sound. I'm not saying that's what it was. I'll have to actually see a Bigfoot before I'll say they exist. But that recording is pretty much what I've heard there. It's the only haunted place I've ever run across in Oregon, and the only place in the west or southeast where I've heard anything like that. La Cueva de los Tallos. A cave system in Ecuador has been explored before, but not fully due to religious reasons, superstitions from the Aboriginals, and because the Ecuadorian government, for some reason, has it practically off limits to anyone, instead giving permission to explore a smaller cave system that is connected to the former but is not the real one. Different artifacts have been found, but a special one stands out in a human eagle form, most likely a god, that is, for all intents and purposes, exactly the same as another one that is found in ancient Mesopotamia, if I'm remembering correctly, which is weird considering that ancient cultures didn't have any sort of contact with each other. That, plus gold and scripts, is the normal Indiana Jones stuff. Oh, and Neil Armstrong was once there as part of one of the expeditions in the 1970s. The Australian Outback. The Aborigines have lived in Australia for roughly 50,000 years, and they're arguably the oldest ongoing cultural group of humans on the planet. A lot of their cultural practices and stories go back thousands upon thousands of years. So they've been in Australia for a long time. But you know what still hasn't been fully explored? The Australian Outback. It's huge, and large swathes of it are basically the surface of Mars with minor scrubland. It's hot, it's dry, and it's inimical to human life. Ants, lizards, and all sorts of little critters love it, but Australia has 4 deserts in the middle of the continent, and humans still haven't explored a ton of them. Some estimates say that roughly half of Australia hasn't been explored or touched by humans yet. Imagine that. There have been humans there for 50,000 years, and we still haven't explored the entire thing. I live in St. Paul, Minnesota, and we have a network of tunnels beneath the city. Mostly sandstone caverns that were hollowed out from eons of water draining down the Mississippi. Some were excavated by humans. Downtown St. Paul has a number of chambers that are connected, and some are connected to the network of caverns. Notably, the site of the old Ford plant had massive caverns and networks of tunnels from mining the sandstone for automotive glass at one point. Many of the tunnels have been sealed off with locked doors, and if you drive down the bluffs, you will find doors that seem to lead nowhere. There are also some sealed doors in the basements of a number of buildings, often sealed over with drywall or other construction to keep people out. Some people say the network connects from one end of our city all the way to the far side and nearly connects to Minneapolis. In myth and legend, these tunnels descend a good way into the earth, and some folklore has ghosts and other creatures of the night living down there. In some iterations of the World of Darkness, these tunnels were used by various vampire clans as their home, notably the Nosferatu and the Tsemis clans. I would love to explore these, however, they are very dangerous, poorly explored, and mapped, and people get lost every year. Sometimes the fire department and rescue teams get them out. Sometimes they get out of their bodies. And sometimes people vanish with no evidence. The last group, I assume, found something that man was never meant to know about. The old Graveyard of Algu in Hérault, France. I was camping in the neighborhood, and we visited the village, which was old and beautiful. We were young and inquisitive and climbed the wall around an old graveyard. What we found were 19th century graves, often in little grave houses. But grave robbers had yanked the lead coffins out of the houses, and everywhere were open coffins with skeletons. It was actually very sad to behold. There were 5 of us, and without a warning, we all ran to the wall and jumped back to the world of the living. We all had a feeling we should not stay there a second longer. We could not explain it, just an overwhelming feeling of terror. About 15 years later, I passed that cemetery on the back of a motorcycle and just looked through a crack in the wall. I was struck with that same feeling. It is not a good place. A random trail in a rural part of Pennsylvania. Me and my boyfriend were driving around, exploring the area. I think we were looking for a place to smoke. It was almost sunset when we came across a closed office building with a completely empty parking lot. We parked in the way back, and before we did anything, we noticed a trail going through large grass and bushes. So we decided to go out and explore it. I think people worked back there at some point, because the trail would section off into larger openings with mounds of mulch and dirt and then shrink back into a thinner trail again. After about 10 to 15 minutes of walking through, we came across a crossway in the trail. It became significantly darker at that crossroads than the rest of the trail was. It was pretty dark out at this point, but the crossway was almost pitch black. At that point, we stopped dead in our tracks, and I felt very heavy and scared all of a sudden. I was a little on edge the whole time, but something in me was not letting me go any further. My boyfriend and I agreed that we should go back to the car. I've been to many abandoned buildings, and I've also gone on walks with my friends or boyfriend late at night in the dark. And I've felt a little on edge while doing those things, but I've never felt what I felt on that trail before. The best way to describe it would be a genuine feeling of terror at the thought of going further and a sense of heaviness and dread. Looking back, I'm really glad we decided to turn back. Well, my story happened about 20 years ago. Some friends and I had had a really stressful week at work and decided, very late at night, around 2 in the morning, to go on a bit of a joyride. We were all around 18 at the time, working hourly, dead-end jobs, and just needed a little fun. We started just driving around town with no real destination in mind, but eventually decided we wanted to go to the southern, more rural part of Virginia Beach. In the past, I had taken Elbow Road as a shortcut to get down to the Outer Banks, so I figured that I would take that route again. The road is completely desolate, or at least it was 20 years ago. There were no houses, and even the roads it connected to were sparsely populated, a real no man's land. We actually drove down the road all the way, and nothing at all happened. But that's where things started to get weird. See, I am really good with directions. So, when we were sitting at the end of Elbow Road, with the choice to make a right or left, I made a right to head back towards my apartment. The joyride was about to end. But that's not what happened. Somehow, we ended up back at the beginning of Elbow Road. To this day, I cannot explain it. It was almost as though we had all lost time. None of us in the car remember driving back around. At this point, my 2 passengers, 2 young women in their late teens, implored me to turn around and not go down Elbow Road again. I agreed, and though we were already heading down the road, I decided that I would find a place to turn around. So, after I rounded the corner of the road's namesake curve, I started looking for a spot. That search was quickly squashed, however, as the girls in the car started screaming at the top of their lungs. Ahead of us, in the middle of the road, were 2 glowing eyes. As they screamed, I began laughing harder than I think I ever have before or since. I saw what was in the middle of the road, and it was a small, harmless dog, and as the car approached, he scurried towards the side of the road. Well, the girls demanded that I turn around right there. They asked that I make a 3-point turn and go home immediately. I noticed that there was a scattering of gravel at the narrow road's edge, so I figured it wasn't a bad spot to complete the maneuver anyway. But as I began to turn my steering wheel to the left and my headlights flooded the edge of the road, we saw a man kneeling down, snapping for his little dog to run over to him. He was wearing khaki cargo shorts, Nike running shoes, and a black hoodie with the hood up, though we could not see his face even with our high beams shining directly at him. Since we were miles from any house where the man reasonably could have lived, I decided to jerk the car back on the road and floor it. I didn't want to have anything to do with a man who decided it would be a sane thing to do to run with no flashlight and darkly colored clothing on a desolate road at 3 a.m. But I didn't think that I had seen a ghost. I thought I saw a weird man. Sure, it was extremely creepy to encounter a no-faced human in the middle of nowhere at night, but surely weirder things have happened. Not to mention, I've never believed in ghosts, and I didn't plan to start that night. However, a couple of years later, while waiting for an appointment at a university I was applying to, I decided to peruse the campus bookstore while I waited. I came upon a book called Weird Virginia, and its entry is about Elbow Road. You see, Elbow Road is infamous in the area for another haunting, the Witch of Elbow Road. I read the entry about her, and at its conclusion, it said, "But she isn't the only one who haunts Elbow Road," and continued to recount the ghost of a jogger, who was allegedly killed while running with his dog. The blood drained from my face when I read that, and I called my 2 friends who had seen what I saw that night and told them what I had read. To this day, it's really hard for me to reconcile what I've seen with my disbelief in the supernatural. I can't explain it, but I can well say that something's not quite right with Elbow Road. Thomas House Hotel in Tennessee. Very creepy place. I stayed in the Sarah's room. I had a lot of strange noises, and my girlfriend was touched, which freaked her out. We had a complete tour of the place one weekend when no other guests were there. The original owners gave us the keys to the old church across the street, and there was lots of activity in there as well. Hales Bar Dam in the Chattanooga area is very eerie as well. I saw some strange things at Resurrection Cemetery in Chicago. My guess isn't one single area, but from what I have personally investigated and experienced, the entire southern area of the US has some of the creepiest places. Red Ash Cemetery, both, in Caryville, Tennessee, is sort of hidden down a long stretch of road that is very unsettling even in the daytime. I have heard voices and seen shadow people every time I have gone, plus a grave statue that seems to be illuminated even on a moonless night. It is towards the bottom of the first cemetery, near a tree, if you are local and want to find it. Pittsburgh Hospital in TN, and as someone else said, St. Augustine in FL, especially the Lighthouse, and Charleston, South Carolina, are loaded with ghost stories, especially the original churches and the USS Yorktown ship. Louisiana is the mecca for paranormal as well, voodoo, vampires, plantation ghosts, etc. In Augusta County, there is a Dejarnet Sanitarium. I went there when I was a teenager because it's just kind of a local legend, and shithead kids do what shithead kids do. We hopped the fence and walked around for an hour or so. We didn't make it too far into the buildings because some of the people I was with were actually scared and swore they were hearing and seeing things, so we left. It wasn't until some years ago that I actually learned the history of this douchebag who founded the sanitarium and how he was essentially a Nazi who tortured and maimed a lot of people. Every time I see it now, I just shudder a little bit because that shit is real and that shit is scarier than any ghosts or stuff that I could think of, and I would much rather stay away from that place, not because I'm sure it could be haunted or anything, but because it was just an evil place that people went to and were taken advantage of in the name of eugenics and cleansing the population. So there's a place you can pull off right before the Frontier Culture Museum and get out, but if you want to park, there is only a little space leading up to the gates, and your vehicle's visible from the road. There is a hotel just a third of a mile up the road where you can park and walk down, and I am positive you could spend as much time as you want there as long as you aren't being disruptive or drawing attention. It's technically private property, but again, if you're not drawing attention to yourself, you'll be left alone. I stopped a year or two ago to take some pictures to send to some people, and I'm sure I could have gone in and walked around if I wanted to. Again, there's no way that's happening because it's a Nazi hospital, so I stay away. Well, my town, which I will not name for privacy reasons, has existed for a good 200 years or so and has a huge amount of hauntings. I'm just wondering if you guys have similar stories or explanations. To start things off, I'll tell you about the only time something paranormal has happened to me personally. There's this old shop in the center of town that was a morgue, then a hardware store, and is now one of my best friends' gyms. We're all high schoolers, although I just graduated. So the layout of this place is that the main floor is a gym, and there's an office on the second floor. In the very center of the gym is a staircase leading down to the basement. In the basement, there's a giant furnace that used to be attached to a furnace, a hand crank elevator, and a closet full of old hardware, tools, scrap, etc. The hardware store owners sold it to my friend's mom because it was extremely haunted, like a full-on poltergeist that would throw cans of paint across the store. None of us believed them, and we decided to scare ourselves by playing hide and seek in the dark in the haunted basement. So we were finishing up a round. There were 5 of us, 3 were upstairs since they got caught, and it was just me and Stefan. I caught him, and we were heading upstairs to get the others when we heard a giant crash from the closet. We were about 5 feet away, and Stefan swears he saw a shovel not only fall over but fly off its hook and hit the other wall 10 feet away. We got freaked out and bolted. My mom is very interested in paranormal stuff as well, so we went to a local shop that is supposed to be haunted by the ghost of a guy who killed himself. Well, my mom and her friend went into the shop late at night and did the whole "what's your name? Are you angry? Can you see us?" There was no activity, but after my mom and her friend came home, they replayed the recordings they took, and after my mom asked, "Can you see us?" a voice answered, "I can ducking see you, bitch." My mom sold all of her ghost books, destroyed the recordings, and attended almost every service at church for nearly 2 months afterwards. She even went so far as to cut off ties with her friend. Well, the owner of this shop knows that it's haunted, and several years ago, he hired a medium. I do not put any trust in mediums, but as the medium drove into town, they said that the town was very evil, and I was surprised anyone could live here peacefully. Of course, take that with a grain of salt since it's a medium, but after hearing that, I did a little investigation, and nearly every store owner has reported hauntings or demons. There was even a possession that was covered up a decade ago, but nobody talks about it. The last story I know well is the tale of the old blacksmith building. It sits in the town center square, and in the 1800s, the blacksmith's daughter threw herself from the 3rd story and died on impact. Ever since then, people have seen her face in the window, and the owner often hears whispering when they're working alone. Another strange thing about the town that scares me the most is that we live in a tornado alley, and every town around us has been hit. We haven't been hit since, off the top of my head, about 1910-15. A lot of people have chalked it up to geography, and I'd agree with them except for a phenomenon I've never personally witnessed. In the center of town is a church with a giant field out back. During the most severe storms, a tiny tail touches down in the center of the field. It never does any damage, and it seems to only be seen by a few people. It is the strangest thing in this town, in my opinion. I know a few others, but not very well, but nearly every single building that has existed since the 1800s has some spooky stories, with some seeming more true than others, but entire buildings have been sold because of the hauntings. If you guys want to offer up your opinions, that would be nice. I want to know if this town is really evil. In my opinion, I think that this place exists in a thin space between our world and another that makes it susceptible to phenomena. But that's just my opinion. There's a house that sits on the way to a local trail. A long gravel drive splits a weedy field full of hawthorn brush. Big sugar maple trees hide the house all summer. It isn't until winter that the place grabs your attention. The house is thin. 2 stories. The roof is tin and looks to have been tacked on like an old hay barn. I think it was once a form of blue, but now it is chalky gray. The fascia under the tin is a black line from the distance of the road. Even from far away, you can see it's saturated. Rotten. There's an old, 70s looking pickup truck parked on the slope of the driveway just up front of the house. It's the only vehicle. It never moves. For years, I thought the house was abandoned. Until one cold day, I saw smoke hanging in the trees above it. I swear it's leaning. Sagging. It'll sound strange, but when I look at that house, I feel something pulling at me. It's hard to put into words. My wife asked if I thought someone was tied up in the basement. It's not that at all. It just feels like a physical force points me towards the house. Like little hands made of wind, pushing. The freakiest place I've ever been is called Point Road in Jerusalem, North Carolina. Near Salisbury. There's a creepy-ass church, a big-ass nearly hidden pet cemetery, and the road is blocked off after the cemetery, but there's a lot of really weird shit past there. A barn full of weird paperwork about core samples, a burned-down murder house, and strange motor noises and beeping in places, no sources to be found. The road was originally created to move slaves from a nearby river, and Daniel Boone owned property nearby too. I've had some really effed up stuff happen to me there. Okay. So the church. It's old and Lutheran. It sits on brick pillars instead of a foundation, so you can sort of see underneath it. There are several years listed above the front door. I'll have to look for pictures to get the exact dates, but it's odd. The first time I drove past it, I saw this black thing like circling the bell tower / steeple bit on the roof. It looked like a black living cloak, it's hard to describe. Almost like a giant bat wing? Like a black liquid leather sort of wrapping itself around the top of the steeple. The word I heard in my mind was shade. I don't really know what a shade is in a supernatural definition, but that was the word in my brain. It just popped in there when I saw it. The church has a tiny graveyard behind it that has strange lights. And crunching sounds like someone is walking around with you, but you never see anyone. I've had friends who told me that they dream about the church too, and a man on horseback. 2 separate people have told me about dreaming they get caught in a rainstorm, have nowhere to go except under that church, and are approached by a man on a horse. I haven't found much information on any of the pointy roads, though. I think it's a huge mystery, especially the barn and the weird file cabinets in there. The beeps and engine noises are unnerving. I may have seen a UFO near the pet cemetery. It's like there is so much strange energy there. Is it ghosts? Aliens? Government secrets? Why is the road closed? That just happened like 2 years ago, the barricade. Why? Some tiny town. I don't remember the name of the area between Innisfail and Townsville in Queensland, Australia. It felt like one of those places in a B-movie where everyone had given up and were just zombies, but on an old western set. The men leered and the women yelled at us from porches as we drove down the main street a little after sunset. But it was too late to make it to the next town when we rolled into town, and we needed a place to sleep. We ended up in the creepiest hostel / motel that doubled as a casino on the ground floor. It had apparently been built in the Victorian era, or at least looked like it. While we were eating dinner, a super weird guy came up to us to tell us that people had been murdered in the hostel when it was originally a house, that it was haunted by a malevolent ghost, and that we needed to make sure we locked the shared bathroom door when we used it. A couple down the hall fought for hours, and all of the other people seemed like they were down and out, had a mental illness, were on very heavy drugs, or were otherwise on the fringes of society. It definitely felt like we were somewhere we weren't supposed to be. My friend and I were assigned separate single rooms, so that didn't help. I slept on top of the covers in my sleeping bag instead of on the bed. It seemed dirty, but I felt safer in my own bedding, with my pocket knife open under my pillow. I kept my sleeping bag unzipped in case I needed to jump out of bed quickly. I turned the lights off and got in bed, but I was still on high alert. Something just didn't feel right. I thought I heard the doorknob twist like someone was testing if it was unlocked at one point, so I immediately turned the lights back on and made some noise. I kept the lights on the whole night. I guess I thought, if something is going to happen, I want to be able to see it. I was terrified to use the bathroom without my friend standing in front of it. We hightailed it out of there without much sleep as fast as we could the next morning. We didn't even eat breakfast. I'll never forget how scared I was. Never ever again. If I ever get that feeling again, I'm dragging my friend back to the car, and we'll drive all night to somewhere safe if we have to. In 2016, I drove alone from East Tennessee over the mountain to Boone, North Carolina, for a concert. Driving home, Google Maps got me really dirty, and I ended up driving through the Cherokee National Forest trying to find my way back to Pigeon Forge. There is no main road, it is all twisting through the forest. I had a gas-sucking Cadillac, and having seen gas stations on the way in, I awaited finding the same since I was running way low. It was midnight, and I was driving deep in that forest. There was no cell service, no signs telling me where I was or where I was headed, and this was definitely not gas station territory. I didn't even know which state I was in. I saw one car pass me throughout the entire drive. Minus my weaker headlights, no light anywhere, just the tree and road illumination ahead. I had to watch my speed because I was sitting a pubic hair above empty and it was going down. Eventually, after coasting on fumes, I found a gas station open as I got near the interstate, but never again. I know I was in that forest for 45 minutes to an hour, and it was easily the most terrifying I have ever felt in my life. Imagine your car stopping like that, with no idea what will happen. I've heard several stories from others who know that same feeling. One was a visitor who told me her husband worked for state police and said there are multiple places in that area where cops refuse to venture into. She said there are some seriously scary people that live up there and that there are also too many supernatural tales over the years. I live in the Smokies and have never been scared, but screw that forest. I never went to Boone again. Playground in a town called Kitimat. I've lived in this town twice, once when I was 11 for almost 2 years, and again when I was 19 for almost 2 years. There's a playground that was built up the hill while I lived there the second time that is haunted as all get out. The equipment is new, but I believe breaking ground must have bothered something. I don't know if it was from disturbing the area with the build or if there was something in the woods that just kind of came out when the equipment was brought in or what, but it's a lot. There's an older playground less than 100 steps from where the new one is being built. At night, my friend and I liked to walk and would end up at the playground because it was well lit, and hanging out on the swings is always nice, in my opinion. The first time we noticed something was up, we were sitting on the swings, looking toward the new playground. It was a completely still night, not so much as a breeze. At the new playground, there were little yellow flags around the half-built equipment, and they started slapping like they were in a gust of wind. And then it stopped. And started. A few times. One of the things that were actually fully built was a little bridge with chain sides that linked the little playhouse with the slide to the platform where the monkey bars would start. Out of nowhere, and I say we because she and I both snapped toward the noise at the same time and both said we heard it, heard footsteps running and the chains shaking like someone was running across the little bridge. We both looked at each other and kind of had a WTF was that? Moment, and then there was giggling. We are both somewhat into the paranormal, so we were fascinated. We walked toward the new park to get a better look, and there were shadows running around the equipment. The chains rattled, the swing moved, and the flags flicked in the non-existent wind. We decided to leave for the time but went back about a week later, this time with some little tea light candles, notebooks, phones for recording, and what have you. We made sure we went back on a windless night. By then, the park was finished and accessible, so we decided to sit in the little playhouse area. Again, shadows seemed to be running around the area. We lit a couple little tea lights and put them between us, set up phones, and started talking. We didn't get any recordings because both our phones went dead almost immediately. The candles went out and were lit. My friend said she got the sense they were afraid of the flames, so we stopped lighting them a couple times. I started asking who they were and what they wanted, and I got hit with the most overwhelming sadness and grief I've ever felt and ended up sobbing. My friend tells me I was asking for my mom between sobs, but I don't remember doing so. We didn't stay long, it was too intense. On the way out, every single street light went out one by one when we walked by, and then came back on when we reached the next one. We didn't go back again for a long time. The last time we did, we didn't even make it onto the playground. It had been thundering earlier in the day, and when we got to the edge of the playground, there were what had to be a dozen plus black shadows absolutely rushing and running like mad all around the park, and it scared the hell out of us. I don't know what it is about that town, but everyone I knew there had a paranormal story of some kind. I had many experiences there myself. The whole town is a hotspot. That said, it's a gorgeous town with fantastic amenities and the best library I've ever been to. 10/10 would recommend to anyone. Though be warned, the last winter I was there, we got 15 feet of snow in a single 2-day storm, and that's completely normal for there. Edinburgh Manor in the barren backroads of eastern Iowa is by far the most active place I've ever been in my almost 10 years of experience. My first investigation there will probably be the most eventful of my life, no matter how long I do this. My team and I got whistled at, screamed at, stomped toward by unseen footsteps, taunted with full-sentence EVPs, recorded thrown objects in empty rooms, and even experienced a chair moving by itself. 2 people I went with entered as hardcore skeptics and are now firm believers. The place is so haunted that I drove cross-country to investigate again 3 years later, only to encounter this time a slammed door, whispers, an object thrown at me from an abandoned hallway, and the most unexplainable Estes sessions I've ever heard in my life. New Hampshire. Gilson Road Cemetery, Nashua, New Hampshire, is such a sure thing. It's where I routinely go with reporters, especially skeptical critics. The wooded area behind it, Knee Corner, up the path, can be treacherous, especially where the hill drops off, but it's a relatively unexplored site without energy in the middle of the day. I'm not so impressed with Blood Cemetery, Pine Hill Cemetery, Hollis, New Hampshire, especially since the vandalism at the Abel Blood Grave. It was never a wildly haunted location when I was there, though I did witness some quirky crypto activity and a few ghostly moments at dusk. After dark, the police patrol regularly. Not recommended for nighttime investigations. Frankly, I suspect some natural magnetic activity, affecting electrical devices, may explain much of what goes on there. Not near Massachusetts, but worth mentioning, at the Spalding Inn, Whitefield, in the carriage house, the back right corner of the upstairs floor is pretty reliable. Audible voices, EMF spikes, and, in the off-season, the flies. On the other hand, some are more creeped out by Mrs. Spalding's personal room, at the top of the stairs, first room on the left. I wouldn't plan to get much sleep in either room in the off-season. When that building is officially open for guests, it's a totally different story. I wouldn't expect reliable research results then. On my to-do list, the empty foundation across the street from the Spalding Inn seems odd. I'm not sure that it's actually haunted, but if I were at the Spalding and had some spare time, I'd check that site at night. Back at the southern border of NH, the Ting Mansion site, across the line in Tingsboro, Massachusetts, near Nashua, New Hampshire, is excellent when it's active, but it's not reliable. Several nearby sites have been reported since the mid-19th century, but I haven't checked them out. Massachusetts. The Old Manse in Concord has a lot of activity, especially in areas where soldiers fell or experienced intense emotions, on either side of the bridge or up the hill. Check the energy around the nearby dig, the early foundation, too. The mass grave at the edge of Harvard Square, Cambridge, is overlooked by most people, and the EMF spikes can be regular and intense. However, since it's a busy spot, it's not easy to investigate there. It has too many street lights, lots of noise, and people wondering what you're doing. Almost anywhere along the actual Battle Road path can be good. Start at Lexington and work your way towards Boston. There are plenty of unexplored, uncontaminated locations. Obviously, it'll be most active immediately after the annual April reenactments. Boston's site of the Coconut Grove fire is just plain weird. It's a parking lot, mostly, but the fence around it behaves strangely and fairly reliably. Watch the nearby streetlights, too, as they can get brighter and darker at random times, coinciding with some EMF and thermal activity at the site. I need to get back there for EVP, it might be really good. The Lizzie Borden house is good, but I wouldn't trust all research results without checking for ungrounded wiring issues, normal but elevated EMF. It was noted most strongly at the pipes in one of the upstairs bedrooms, which indicated that there could be intermittent issues throughout the house. Spider Gate, Worcester, gets mixed reviews. People either find nothing at all or they leave raving about how scary it is. Those are the sites that come to mind right away. Well, I live in the middle of nowhere in Alabama to begin with, 10 minutes away from the closest gas station and further from the closest store. I live about half a mile down a several mile long dirt road. One time I had several of my friends over, a bunch of teenage boys about 17 to 19 at the time, and they all got drunk and decided they wanted to go walking down the dirt road. I went along as the only sober one, and the only one who knew the land. When we reached the end of the road, about 4 miles down, I suggested we turn back. My friends were very drunk and determined to keep walking even if there wasn't any road, so they jumped the gate and kept going. By this point, we are deep into the woods, with no cell service of any kind, no traffic, and no houses in sight. This was a particularly quiet night for South Alabama, as there were no crickets, frogs, or coyotes, just the sound of breathing. We got to an old warehouse I didn't know was there after a while, and of course they wanted to go into the spooky-looking abandoned warehouse, but as soon as we walked in, we realized it wasn't abandoned. There were what looked like red pentagrams on the floor and walls, everywhere as high as it seemed a person could reach, and piles of animal pieces, deer horns and legs scattered everywhere, coyotes' teeth, goats' hooves, and pigs' heads. It was terrifying, but nobody was in the room. We ran quickly when we heard chanting from the next room over, and we didn't stop or look back till we got to my house and collapsed in the living room. All of my friends, 4 different people, were either so drunk or terrified that they blocked it all out and didn't remember a thing, but I now live with the knowledge that all of that is only a few miles away from my house. I live in New York, Long Island. The Pine Barrens are pretty much my backyard, so there's a lot of deep and unexplored wilderness. Anyway, I was letting my dog outside and decided to take a look outside to make sure no animals were there and the coast was clear. I thought I heard music, but I thought my mind was playing tricks on me. I waited a couple minutes and then heard the sound I had heard before. It wasn't music, but it was a sort of animal sound. It sounded like a seal and a donkey combined. It made the noise a seal would make with the rhythm of a donkey. One thing that caught my attention was that it was moving. I heard it initially from what sounded like 30 feet away, and then it sounded a couple 100 feet away 15 seconds later. I think that either this thing was moving incredibly fast without making much noise. Remember, this is the Pine Barrens. Anything moving that fast would have made at least an audible noise that I could have heard from where I was standing, or there were 2 or more of these things. We don't have any wild dogs or anything around here. No coyotes or wolves live on Long Island, so I doubt some escaped from the zoo. So I'm wondering if it could be something paranormal, which is why I'm sharing it here. Does anyone know what it could be and if it fits in line with a legend or something? Haunted place in Algeria, many testimonies. Half of my family is from Algeria, and they live in a very green countryside, but there is one hill in this place where nothing can grow, not even grass. I know that there is maybe a scientific explanation to this. But in this place, there is also an old abandoned fort that dates from when the French were occupying the country. As Muslims, we believe in jinns, and jinns live especially in abandoned places and are invisible unless they change their shape, sometimes just to scare people, especially if you come where they live and disturb their peace, and they can also possess people. Many people passing near this place told me about their paranormal encounters, so let's begin. My father, who is a Muslim and believes in jinns, but most of the time he finds a rational explanation for what many people think is paranormal, was visiting his family in this countryside when he was around 17 or 18. He liked a lot to walk alone at night in this countryside, and one night he was near this haunted place. As he was walking, he saw, there was a full moon, so even at night we could see, on a small hill not very far from him, a man who was very tall. He kept walking toward him. But as he was closer to this, he saw that it was a donkey, alone in the middle of nowhere. There was no farm around, not moving. This story is now about a few people, cousins, I think. They were walking, at night, back to their home, and the road passed near the old fort, but this fort is on the top of a hill. They were 2, I think, and nobody was behind them. And then suddenly a creepy man that nobody knows surpassed them, like he went out of nowhere, and then continued walking on this road until he disappeared through the night. Here's another testimony, very creepy this time. There is someone in my family who is very normal, sane, etc. and has never had hallucinations, but when he was in this countryside during a night gathering, it's common to do this during the summer, he began to talk with someone that nobody was seeing. It happened 2 times. And here's the last story, the most scary of all. It's not in the same place, but it's still the same kind of story. It's about the grandma of my stepmother. She lived in a rural village in the mountains. When she was a child, she often helped her mother with various things and was woken up by her around 6 a.m. one day. During the night around 4 a.m., she heard and saw what was like her mother telling her to wake up. She was, according to my stepmother, sure that she was not dreaming, so she got up and didn't find her mother. She went to her room and saw that she was sleeping. This is a recollection from a few years ago. Myself and a collection of close family and friends went camping in a bit of forest in the UK. The spot we chose had a river running through it and was bowl-shaped. A forest track ran past it by the lip of the bowl, where we parked all our cars. We camped at the bottom of the bowl, next to the river. The entire area had a mixture of thick trunk pines and silver birch trees. When you look up from the bottom of the bowl, you're surrounded by forest and rock cliffs on one side and a steep but climbable wood up to the road on the other. The first day went pretty normal. We set up tents, played with the kids in the river, and found dead wood for fires. In the morning, we lay about in the sun looking up into the forest, and shapes were forming in the trees. It's hard to describe completely. It was like the trees shifted and formed archways and structures, still very organic but at the same time far more structural than a haphazard forest, sort of Art Nouveau in style. Solid but difficult to focus on. I mentioned this to my friend, and she agreed that the forest was odd, but I'm not sure if she saw the structures I was talking about. Most people mentioned acoustic oddities. Some reported hearing more children laughing and shouting, some reported hearing men talking, and some reported hearing constant chattering. The river and bowl structure of our camp may have enhanced these sounds, and perhaps we were hearing another camp or just making sense out of water burblings echoing. Later on, when everyone was up, I decided I wanted to go upstream by jumping from rock to rock, clambering over larger rocks, and climbing the little cliffs. Nobody else wanted to get wet and muddy, so I got changed and headed upstream alone, giving it a rough time to expect me back. To begin with, I had a great time. It felt good to be active, solving climbing problems and getting some cuts and scrapes. Things got strange around a bend in the river with a waterfall, a natural dam, and a small cave opening at the top. It was a sharp turn in the river, which was crisscrossed with large fallen trees. There was a small waterfall, not very tall, that was passable by zigzagging across the river on the logs. The final log crossing would take me over the waterfall and onto a rocky shelf. I would be crossing this opposite and in full view of the cave. Before starting, I rested a little, listening to the forest and enjoying the day sitting on a rock, but it did feel oddly tense. Naturally, I thought it was my own feelings of trepidation crossing the logs, not knowing how slippery they would be. The first log I sat and pulled myself across on my bum as it felt too slippery to walk over. Coming to the last log, I found it thick, dry, and simple to cross balance. I was tottering over it, and all I could hear was the rushing of water, and I got a really strong feeling of being watched. Full-blown heebie-jeebies. I crossed over onto the other side. The cave was off to my left a little, and I sat back in the rocks. It had a small amount of water running through it and was very dark inside. Feeling skittish, I turned right and began to make my way over slippery rocks, watching my footing with my back to the cave. I looked into the distance where I was headed. The river was wider and much shallower up here. There was a lot of visible dry riverbed. I looked into the distance and stopped suddenly. I could see a man and a collie dog standing still, watching me. It was a weird atmosphere, as if we were both standing still, watching each other, waiting to see what the other would do. Sometimes they would shift a little, as if they were moving slightly closer, but I never actually saw them move. I had this pressing feeling to avoid them in my mind and a really strong feeling to go back and hide in the cave. That's the resounding option in my mind. Hide in a cave. I was massively in two minds because why in hell would I want to hide from a dude and his collie? He's seen me. If I just turned around and went into the cave, that would be creepy as duck for him. It was just not logical. I have no fear of dogs. It made no social sense, but it felt like a sort of play on social anxiety without being anywhere near rational for me. I looked back at the man and the dog and forced myself to really take a good, hard look at them. It felt like I had to push my brain to actually look, and the man and the dog became nothing, shapes in the debris like the structures in the trees. There, but completely not there when looked at fully. And all I felt was the skin on my scalp tightening, crawling, and weirding out about behind me, where the cave was. I left pretty sharpish after that. On my way back down to the camp, I skipped around this part of the river using the forestry track. I know this experience is a bit more psychological or subtle, not even overtly paranormal, and maybe my brain was just having a bit of a moment. I don't know, but it was weird as hell, and I've never felt anything like it before or since. I briefly mentioned it to my father, who is very spiritual and has himself had some strange experiences. All he would really say is that some places are very old, they have a strange sort of power of their own. Sometimes, it can be nourishing to visit. Overall, it was a beautiful camping spot, and we had a great time. It was just upstream and the cave that were off to me. I don't know why the duck this happened, but by the end of it, you'll understand when I say my parents aren't known for making the best decisions. So, when I was 9 or 10, my dad took me to this house that had been basically destroyed by fire. I don't remember exactly whether my mother was there or if she just oked this They were not together, ever. There were other adults involved in this too, I think my uncle and one of my dad's buddies. But I was the only kid. Anyway, we went into this fire-destroyed house to look for shit that could be salvaged. We found very little, and really, that should have been nothing at all. All I really recall anymore was an 8-track tape that had been warped just enough by the fire to play 2 songs at once in spots. So there's little kid me, after dark, picking my way through this ducking burnt house full of debris, and I get into one room and look in what had been the closet, and there's this shag rug looking thing there. Which was when my dad helpfully told me that the daughter of the house had run back inside the fire to try to save the family dog and died in the closet with her arms wrapped around the animal, and that wasn't a rug but the remains of the dog's body. And then I was encouraged to look through this dead kid's toys to see if anything was in good enough condition for me to take home. I've been afraid of dying in a fire ever since. I discovered the dark secrets of the forest I live in. I live in the forest of a large Croatian city. I consider myself lucky to live in a place so remote and peaceful yet so close to civilization. It especially came as a blessing during the quarantine. That being said, living in this forest has its quirks that make you question how much of a heaven the place you call your home actually is. I moved here around 5 years ago, but it was today that I finally discovered the dark truth about its past. I'd like to share what I found, but let's take it back first to the day I realized there might be something more to the place than the human I can perceive. It was a hot summer day a few years ago, and I was walking my dogs through the forest. I had recently discovered a new path, but I had never walked there before, as I didn't know how long it was or how much time it would take to walk through. This time, though, I had the whole day to myself, so I finally gave in to my curiosity and ventured onto the unexplored path. It seemed fairly normal, although it was way more quiet and seemed more isolated than the rest of the forest paths. The path was surrounded by steep valleys on both sides, which ended in deep wooden areas at the bottom, possibly inhabited only by animals. Or, at least, nothing human. I stopped for a moment to give my dogs water and take a short break. Sitting on the ground while they drank, I was enjoying the calming sounds of the forest until the peaceful atmosphere was sharply interrupted by something downright disturbing. I heard a human voice shouting from the bottom of a valley. But it's not just any voice. It was my voice. And it was calling my name. I stayed there for a couple of moments, just to make sure I was hearing it right, as it didn't make any sense. And sure enough, it was calling my name again and again. I got up and ran home as fast as I could. Every step of the way, I felt watched and more paranoid as I felt like I'm being chased. I did my research at home. I wanted to find an explanation as to what happened to me. It fit the profile of a skinwalker. I don't feel entirely confident enough to conclude that's what it is, though. As I already said in the beginning, I'm from Croatia, and I don't know enough about skinwalkers to know if they can be found here or if they even exist. Anyhow, that possibility didn't make me any more comfortable. Unfortunately, it wasn't a single event. This was only the beginning of strange happenings for me in that forest. I have a hard time falling asleep, so I usually go for a nightly stroll up and down the street before I go to bed. My street is surrounded by forest, but it didn't used to scare me. I was used to the way darkness looked in the trees, and I made peace with being exposed by the street lights to anything that lurked within. After what I encountered, though, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched and hearing leaves rustling as if someone were walking right there in the dark. Every night, I take that walk. I will also sometimes hear my name being called from a distance, just like that day in the summer. I play it safe, so I casually stroll back into the house when it gets too intense, when I feel surrounded by invisible eyes praying for me, just waiting for the right moment. You have to play it cool, don't let them know you know they're there. Seem completely unbothered. Now, that skinwalker theory has stuck with me for a long time, even though I can't prove it. I felt like I was being stalked by one. That was until today, when I found out about something I think I should have known a long time ago. I always knew my forest was an unusual place. Part of it is a memorial park, full of strange monuments. I thought those were just for soldiers that died in World War II and didn't think much of it. I am currently in my 4th year of high school, and we're learning about the World Wars, so that sparked some curiosity to find out more about the forest. What I found left me in shock. Basically, horrible war crimes took place right there, and the ground is filled with mass graves of executed soldiers. According to the official site of the Memorial Park's virtual museum, it is the site where the worst mass war crimes in the modern history of the city of Zagreb were committed. I was shocked, to say the least. Finding that information left me speechless. You'd think I finally got my conclusion, an answer to what it is that haunts my forest. Instead, it just left me with even more questions. I don't know what was calling my name that day. I don't know what entity spies on me or what its intentions are. I don't even know if it's an individual or if there's more of them working in union against something that doesn't belong. The only thing I know for sure is the way it feels. In some way, my concerns seem justified. I am most likely not the only one roaming these woods at night. The forest feels heavier now. The weight of the truth, combined with the burden of worry, leaves the night air tingling with tension. Oh, how the tables have turned. The presence I worry about the most right now is me. I might actually be the one disturbing the pieces of things that were quietly buried in this soil. As much as I don't know their intentions, they don't know about mine. I wish I knew a way to make it clear that I approve their ownership of these grounds and that I am okay with being merely a guest privileged by their peace. Until further notice, I am haunting this place. This was about 20 years ago. Some friends and I had heard about the ruins of an old sanitarium, which was nearby the currently functioning sanitariums run by the state. A couple weeks before Halloween, we loaded into my car at about 7 in the evening and drove off for an adventure. We arrived at the area near 8 o'clock, and after circling the blocks surrounding the active facilities, we finally found what looked to be an empty field, surrounded by tall fencing. We figured this must have been the site of the abandoned and defunct sanitarium, so we parked the car. With flashlights in hand, we piled out of the car and began to walk the perimeter of the fence until we found an opening and made our way inside. As summer has just ended, the grass growing in the field has become quite long, perhaps 3 to 4 feet tall. We walked directly into the field, the grass at chest height at times and brushing against our legs. The terrain slightly dipped as we made our way deeper into the property, and at one point the air surrounding our lower legs and feet dropped in temperature by several degrees. The hair on the back of my neck stood stiffly as we all made a comment about the cool air being more than a little creepy. We pushed on, thrilled to see what awaited us. We walked another 100 feet and began to make out the silhouette of a 2-story building with no roof. As we approached, we could clearly see that the building had either crumbled with time or been knocked down by a wrecking ball. All that remained of the building were a few walls, with a collapsed second floor that lay in a sloped manner, like a ramp begging to be walked up. Only one of my friends dared to go up the crumbled concrete flooring, but we all followed up one by one shortly after determining it was safe enough. As we got up to that second level, we surveyed the area and noticed that there were several other building sites nearby. All the buildings were in similar repair, which is to say they were nearly destroyed entirely and probably not safe to be hanging around. Old beds and pieces of other furniture were strewn about the ruins, slowly rusting and decaying in the open air. Satisfied with our findings, we decided it was best to move on. After getting a taste of the adrenaline, I wanted more and convinced my friends to explore in the direction of the active facilities nearby. We walked away from the ruins and found an exit through the fencing on the opposite side from where we had entered. After 15 minutes of walking along a dimly lit road, we came upon a small, 2-story building. At about 100 feet out, we saw a sign that said this was a facility for juveniles and could make out a few people milling about in what looked like a common area. Realizing that we were likely peering through the windows and watching mental patients, we froze and gazed for a moment. An extreme feeling of uneasiness befell us. As we scanned the profile of the building, we noticed a girl dressed in an all-white hospital gown who was staring at us through the window in what appeared to be her private room. One moment later, we heard the reverberating sound of pounding fists on a window and the shouts of this girl saying, "Get out of my house." Without hesitation, we hightailed it back towards the way we came, made our way to the hole in the fence, back through the field, and to the other hole in the fence from whence we came, and jumped in the car. We didn't speak a word while I fired up the engine, threw the gear shifter in first, and dropped the clutch, leaving a little burned rubber in our wake. As we drew nearer the freeway entrance, we all let out a bit of nervous laughter and a huge sigh of relief. To this day, my friends and I all talk about this experience whenever we are together. I have quite a few. Growing up on Long Island, my dad would always take me on cool adventures and show me all the cool stuff he found in the 40 years prior to me being born. Kings Park Psychiatric Center. My dad only took me around the complex, walking or driving, but later, as a teenager, my friends and I went a few times and explored inside the main building or tower in one of the other buildings. The creepy part about the other building was the way in, which was through the basement. All sorts of pentagrams and creepy writing are all over the place. The entire grounds of the KPPC also have massive steam tunnels underneath them, so big that you can walk through them without problem. We did that once, the air was funky, and our bandanas and masks definitely weren't enough, so we left. Buildings were filled with asbestos. My dad always told us to wear masks if we went in. Burned down Gold Coast Mansion, I think. Another cool place I explored with my dad. The mansion itself had burned down in the 70s or 80s, I believe. But the grounds and property had been untouched for a couple decades, and nature had taken over. The backyard was basically a wooded area, and we're walking through and find this huge stone pool. It was like a legit old school pool made of stone, shaped like a key or something strange. Very sharp edges, very Victorian looking. It creeped me out because we found it mostly in the middle of the woods. Camp Hero, which was the inspiration behind Stranger Things. I explored the SHT out of this place with two of my best friends. A lot of it is sealed off, and the government has flooded the majority of the bunkers and underground portion of the complex. I went inside the old early warning radar building and this one little standalone building that was just a staircase leading down to the bunker. This place was definitely the sketchiest. The first time we went there and were walking around exploring, we noticed that a plain car with tinted windows would show up or drive by us wherever we went. Especially near the old artillery batteries. Fun fact. The government gave the land to the state park system in the 1980s, and the grounds are owned by the state park system. However, the DoD still owns everything beneath the ground, which is quite a lot. If you look up pictures, you'll see concrete entrances to the bunker system, and at first glance, it looks like you could drive a compact car into them if they weren't sealed off with reinforced concrete. But those pictures are misleading. You could drive a howitzer, MLRS system, Abrams tank, etc. through them because they are ducking huge. I have a picture of my best friend standing in front of one of them, and it absolutely dwarfs him. Oh, and there's also still electricity running throughout the entire place. You can hear the buzz in a lot of places, despite nobody living there, the ranger station being near the entrance, and everything being abandoned. There are many conspiracies surrounding the place. And one that I've found to be true is being followed after snooping around. There are countless stories of people saying they were followed for miles and miles after leaving. And after exploring the place as much as I did, I can absolutely confirm. We went to test this theory one day, and my buddy being an ex-Marine with SEER training, we decided to use some evasion tactics and really see what's up. Boy, was that one of the freakiest experiences ever? We were absolutely being looked for by this one tinted Ford Taurus and one tinted Ford Explorer. We made a point not to actually go into the parts that are explicitly off limits for this little test so that we couldn't actually get in trouble. But they were still scanning for us. It was freaky because, even though we were completely out of sight, one of these two cars would somehow end up near us. The absolute scariest time was this one time me and my buddy were hiking through the woods there, accidentally wandered into an off-limits place, didn't know we did, and as we were coming up on a fence to leave the area we were hiking, we saw a big sign that said danger, unexploded ordnance. Meaning we just hiked through an area for the last 40 minutes that likely had UXOs all over the damn place. Me and my friend, both 17, were on holiday at a resort in Norwich, which was situated in a pretty large forest. I had been there once before, about 5 or so years ago, and on that trip, I discovered a small dirt path that led into an uninhabited part of the woods. I was too scared to go very far down it when I first discovered it, and I sort of forgot about it. Fast forward to about 3 days ago, and me and my friend are bored and have like an hour to kill. It's about 9 at this point, and I decide that it would be enjoyable to go on an evening cycle in the woods. My friend is a very skeptical and logical person who isn't a fan of taking risks, so she needed some convincing, but eventually we went. The path took us deep into the forest, so far that we could no longer see any of the lights from the houses around us. It also bordered some kind of field, however, this field was blocked off by a tall metal fence that was topped with barbed wire. We decided to turn back after about 30 minutes of cycling because it was getting dark and we had no torches. When we returned, we were buzzing and decided we had to do that again, but next time we would explore more of the path. 2 days later, we decide it's a good time to explore more of the path. The sun is beginning to set, and it seems like the perfect time to set off. We begin cycling, however, this time things feel different. My friend is getting quite antsy the further down the path we go, and even I begin to get a bit freaked out. Something feels wrong, but we decide to carry on. Eventually, we come to an unexplored area. By this point, night has fallen and it is pitch black, and come across some kind of wooden electricity box. We stared at it for a second. I try to see what's inside but decide it's futile, so we carry on. As soon as we pass that box, the off feeling becomes much worse, and I come to a stop. I ask my friend if we should play some music from a well-known TV show that we both like, as the soundtrack would match the vibe of biking through unknown woods at night. You can probably guess what TV show it is, but anyway, she says yes, so I begin trying to get the music up on Spotify. I had no signal, but that shouldn't have been an issue since I had the album downloaded, it just wouldn't load. I was very absorbed in trying to get it to work, but after a minute, my friend says in a nervous voice, "Is that coming from your phone?" Confused, I go silent, and then I hear it too. I can very faintly hear a song playing. The song is one that recently blew up because it was used in the TV show, and not only that, but the part that is playing is the chorus, which is not at the start of the song. Me and my friend both check our phones, but neither are playing anything. We both then booked it back on our bikes. When we reach the edge of the woods, we both feel the bad vibes wash away instantly. When we got home, we both immediately checked for any possible way the music came from our phones. We both asked our cerise to play that album, but they both said, "I need you to give me access to your Spotify," or something like that. We also checked multiple other things, but nothing gave us an answer. We were both thoroughly freaked out, especially my friend, who is a skeptic and always disproved the many ghost stories and horror movies I'd tell her about. I'm a big horror fan. We went back to the path the next day and even went back to the exact spot, and the vibes were completely gone, and we could find no trace that any other person had been there. Also, some additional information. It was about 9:30ish when we heard the music. It was completely dark out, so if someone was there, we wouldn't have been able to see them, but we would have heard footsteps. The resort itself is close to an RAF base of some kind. The music itself sounded quite reverby and stopped pretty much as soon as we began booking it back, I think. If anyone has any kind of explanation, scientific or paranormal, that would be awesome. We looked into folklore, etc., but couldn't find any explanation of what it could be. So in Nevada, there is this little park, and below this is Robb Canyon, which is a pretty big canyon. Now this place is just creepy overall. The only dead tree in the area stops the river flow, and residents that live near it act strangely like they're out of a Black Mirror episode, like they're outsiders. It has been claimed to be the most haunted place in the West. There is some background on this location. Alright, so the story begins this past July, when me and my friends went to Robb Canyon to give our final say on whether it was haunted, but this time we were checking out the park. Upon our arrival, we see a glimmer of something in the light and stumble across one swing just swinging by itself. Now, this is creepy and all, but we put it aside. My homie goes to the bathroom, and I see him pull a large stick out between the door and the frame. For some reason, he knocked on it, and I thought it was stupid, but as he was walking back, he dead froze and then ran over to me. He says the door knocked back. So following this, about 5 minutes later, we heard a very loud go and, being noticeably freaked out, we still stayed. Suddenly we were being quiet to try and hear the voice, and we heard a female moan bellow through the canyon, followed by that same go. North Park, Colorado, can be scary. There are several stories here that happened to me and my cousin in North Park, Colorado. I will start with the location. We usually camp very near several old mining towns in North Park, Colorado. One is Teller City, and the other is Park City. The first experience my cousin had himself was while we were camping about 100 yards from Park City. I did not experience this myself, but in my opinion, my cousin wouldn't lie about something like this. My two brothers, several of my cousins, and I had stayed up drinking until about 11 or 12 a.m. the night before, having a good time camping. When I woke up in the morning, my cousin was already up and seemed a bit spooked. Apparently, at some point, just before the sun came up, he really had to take a leak and had gotten out of his tent to do so. Just as he was finishing his tinkle and zipping up, he noticed a figure standing next to a tree, not even 50 feet away from his tent location. Because the sun was about to come up, it was pretty light out, and he could give a good description. He said it was a man, probably shorter than him. He is not much taller than me at 5'8" inches, dressed in what looked like 1800s mining clothes, just staring straight at him and not moving. He noped the duck out and got back in his tent until the sun had fully come up. When he came out later, there was no sign of the guy. The next couple of experiences happened at a different campsite, about 3 miles up the road from the Park City campsite. The first happened to me, my two brothers, 2 cousins, and several other girls that came along on the trip. It's important to know that this campsite is really remote, and the closest other generally safe place to camp is at least a mile away. It was probably around midnight, and we were all drinking and having a good time around the fire. All of a sudden, we hear this nasty metallic grinding sound in the forest up the hill from camp. We heard this sound over the load of music we had on in one of my cousin's trucks. It sounded almost like something metallic getting caught in a sawmill. That is the only way I can describe it. It is not something you should hear in the middle of the woods with no one around. Everyone just turned white and looked around at each other in shock. After a few minutes of asking each other, "WTF was that?" things got back to normal, and we began enjoying ourselves again. About 30 minutes later, an eerie feeling just kind of came over the group. Something just didn't feel right. It was like the forest was watching or something. My little brother was freaking out a little more than the rest of us and swore to us that he saw something in the forest about 30 yards away. We just tried to laugh it off, but then my cousin said he had seen something in the opposite direction. At this point, we turned off the music so we could properly listen to the sound coming from the woods. I was about to SHT my pants as I heard what sounded like thumping sounds coming from all around us. At this point, my eyes started playing tricks on me, and everything in the dark seemed to be moving. I started to freak out and told everyone I thought we were being circled by wolves. They are known to venture down to northern Colorado from Wyoming. This explanation caught on with the group and calmed everyone down for a minute or two, and we all kind of relaxed because we were around a rather large fire and it was doubtful that wolves would attack. That was until we heard another weird-ass sound come from the forest up the mountain. This one was also metallic, but more like a growl. Like a grinding and screeching metallic growl. The thumping stopped abruptly, and everything went quiet again. At this point, the girls of the group were done with the shit and headed back to the 10x10 stove tent we had set up at the time. We guys decided to stay up longer and drink some more alcohol. After another 30 minutes or so, we started hearing the wolf pack-like movements again running around camp. This time they sounded really ducking close, but we couldn't see anything. It was shortly after this point that my cousin, the same cousin who had seen the mining man before, had had enough of the spooky situation and had enough to drink, and he grabbed a gun out of his truck and fired it off like 5 times into the ground of the mountain behind us while yelling, "Shut the duck up." Shortly after, we all saw a dark blue light, which looked like a bright orb the size of a pumpkin, float through the forest away from us and up into the sky. We didn't hear anything else weird the rest of the night. The third experience was the scariest and happened a year or two after the previous one. I think this was probably the scariest to me because there was no alcohol involved this time. I had bought a super cheap tent trailer for camping, and my cousin, the same one who saw the miner and shot the gun in the previous experience, and I planned on heading up to the same place we had seen the blue light. This sounds dumb, but we are all fascinated by all the crazy stuff that happens close to these two ghost towns and continue to camp there to this day. So on this particular night, it is raining heavily, and we don't get up to the campsite until late on a Friday night after work, 9:30 p.m. or so. Once we get there, we don't bother getting a fire going and get to setting up the pop-up tent camper we had hauled behind my pickup. Almost immediately, there is a spooky vibe in the air. It feels like the forest is watching, and we rush to get the thing set up. Once the job was done, we went inside the tent camper and dried off. Right after we get settled in, probably at 10 p.m. or so, we start hearing really strange sounds coming from up the mountain. More metallic grinding sounds and thumping on the ground. The thumping sounded more like people this time, and it sounded very close to the camper, maybe 10 feet, if I had to guess. After about 10 minutes of listening and neither of us moving an inch, things seemed to calm down, and we both decided it was time to try and sleep even though we were freaked the duck out. Sometime in the middle of the night, my cousin woke me up, asking if I had heard that noise. I told him I was asleep but had not. Just then, the thumping sound came back. It seemed to be all around the camper, and my cousin and I just laid quietly in our beds, frozen in fear. If you are not familiar with how a tent trailer camper works, the beds basically slide out from each end of the trailer, and there is really nothing below the bed you are sleeping on but a few feet of air and ground. With the thumping still going on, I started feeling what felt like tapping under the bed. It started off as a soft tapping and began to get more and more forceful. After about 30 seconds or so, I could feel the bed visibly moving, like someone was banging on the bottom of the bed with their fist. I had no idea what to do with all the sounds coming from outside and the banging on the bed, so I kind of flipped out and just started kicking the bed beneath me with my ears, yelling, "Duck you, leave me alone." All the sounds pretty much stopped immediately after this. Needless to say, neither of us could sleep the rest of the night and just stayed up trying to rationalize the situation. Wolves maybe? Nah. Bears? Maybe, but what in the duck? The rest of the trip was pretty uneventful. This park or walking trail, not too far from our old house, was pretty normal during the day. As soon as it starts getting dark or around evening, it's when things start becoming creepy, especially after dark, to the point where even the cops who have to patrol that area at night will carry a Bible with them. A quick side note is that this walking trail is quite big, and there are small playgrounds scattered throughout the trails. Besides the houses around the outside of the trails, luckily our old house wasn't one of those houses. These stories didn't happen to me personally, but they happened to my younger siblings and our first dog. The only thing that happened to me was the multiple times our dog escaped the backyard due to annoying kids who would purposefully open our backyard gate and run away. So we'd have to chase after her, and since our dog Frisbee loved going to the park to play, knowing this, we know she's either going to beeline straight to the park or our neighbor across the street to play with her best friend. I've only had to help chase frisbee during the day. Luckily, there was still enough sunlight and the creepy feeling hadn't started yet. Now back to the actual story. Like I said before, I wasn't home and was gone on a camping trip with our church youth group. It was very late at night, midnight or later, and Frisbee, our barely a year old puppy, really had to go and wouldn't quiet down. Our younger sister Molly, who sleeps in the basement, hears Frisbee's whimpering and gets up and lets Frisbee outside into the backyard to do her business. After a few minutes, Frisbee doesn't come back to the sliding backyard door. Molly opens the door to go look for Frisbee and sees that the backyard gate is wide open. Immediately, Molly goes to wake up our youngest brother, Vivi. He's the only person who can keep pace with Frisbee when Frisbee's running around. They both grab 2 flashlights and go looking for our escapee, Frisbee. The first place they checked for Frisbee was our neighbor's house, praying that Frisbee was over there wanting to play with her bestie. Nope, Frisbee isn't over there. It wasn't until they heard Frisbee's puppy yelping from a block away in the direction of the haunted park. Molly heads the way as they sprint in the direction of Frisbee's yelping. As they were a block away from the park, Vivi suddenly stopped and looked around before telling Molly that he could hear something moving around them, but Molly told him to just ignore it and just hurry to find Frisbee. After a few more minutes of searching, they find Frisbee in the park. She was completely exhausted at this point. After running all the way there, Molly and Vivi sprint over to Frisbee to pick her up. Again, Vivi starts scanning the area because he can hear something moving around them. He starts lighting the bushes and everything around them with the 2 flashlights he is now holding. Molly, now also noticing the sounds around them, picks up Frisbee in her arms and just tells Vivi to follow her, taking off in a sprint all the way back home, locking the doors behind them. For the rest of the night, Frisbee didn't make another sound, probably because she exhausted herself from the hike she made to the park. A couple months later, I was told this story after Frisbee escaped the yard again. Again, it wasn't dark, so I didn't experience anything because it was during the day. Our mom told me when she was driving me home from college that 2 joggers were jogging along the trail near the lakeside of the park and found a young man who hung himself. We no longer live in that house and moved several blocks away from it, but we still visit a small park along the walk trail, only on the side that we know and during the day. When I was 14, my family went up north to this town called Gaines in Pennsylvania. If you're from the area, you know the main town is lovely, but the outskirts can be quite questionable. My grandfather was from the outskirts, and I swear the whole trip was just creepy. On the way up, our GPS made us take this dirt road off of the highway. Once we were going down the road for about 10 minutes, we found ourselves in front of this old farmhouse that looked as if it were straight out of a horror movie, with a field next to it that only had 1 cow in it. The cow looked as if it hadn't been groomed in a long while, and it visibly had an impacted tooth, tumor-like swelling in the face, and everything just looked run down. We eventually got back to the highway and made it, and we still talk about the road every Halloween. That was only the beginning of the trip. My grandfather's house was we could say patched up. The original building in itself was built in the 1890s as a brothel, if I remember properly. But since then, my grandfather has added on a porch and a new kitchen, as much of the original building was unstable and he had to seal it off. The structure was actually quite comparable to the movie Monster House. The house was always off-putting, and we weren't helped by the fact that it was freezing since this was around late November and we were in the mountains of northern Pennsylvania, almost New York. We slept in the guest bedrooms on the 2nd floor and constantly heard footsteps in the hallways on the 3rd floor. We adjusted by the time we left, but the first night was restless. If I ever go back to Gaines, I can tell you I'm not staying in that house. The house aside, the neighborhood itself was actually creepier. Almost every truck we saw driving around was missing a license plate. There was a trailer park at the end of my grandfather's street, and 2 of the, probably, 30 trailers were selling guns out of them. All of the people in the neighborhood were reminiscent of characters from The Hills Have Eyes, and as a very sheltered and geeky 14-year-old, I was terrified and intrigued at the same time. After talking to my grandfather for a little bit about the interesting characters of the neighborhood, my mom, thankfully, told me to stop taking walks around the neighborhood as there were several registered sex offenders against children my age in the area and unmarked cars. I spent the rest of the trip inside the house for the most part, adjusting to the footsteps and the creepy energy, as well as the smell of sulfur in the water. On the 3rd night of our stay, things somehow managed to get creepier. On the 3rd night and every night after our 8-day stay, there was a rolling blackout. This rolling blackout was different than what you'd imagine, though. At midnight on the dot, the dogs in the whole neighborhood would start barking, the lights would start going out sequentially down the street, and, until the power went out in our house, the TV would remain static. As a disclaimer, I was not mentally sound prior to or during the trip, and there were many family scans going on at the time, so my perception may have been skewed, but that neighborhood was the scariest place on earth the way I saw it.